Good evening and welcome to Late Night Tea with Dr. G. Take a load off, get comfortable. You're going to need your FAR FC book because we're going to start on some various parts in 121 and we shall begin on 121.107. My wisdom from my tea bag says, dream as if you'll live forever. Live as if you'll die tomorrow. James Dean. Okay. All right, 121.107, guys. This is an image from American Airlines Dispatch Center. Every dispatch center generally in the U.S. has the word operations in it. Integrated Operations Center, Global Operations Center, Networks Operations Center, or Network Operations Center. And that's basically wherever the headquarters is at for the airline or the cargo carrier. And this is where dispatchers work. It's also where crew schedulers work, maintenance control, supervisors, everyone that's needed to run the airline from basically behind the scenes is going to work at a dispatch center. And I want to know how many of these are required per 121. So go to 121.107. Remember, we're in our FARFC book. And it says each certificate holder conducting domestic or flag operations must show that it has enough dispatch centers adequate for the operations to be conducted that are located at points necessary to ensure proper highlight operational control of each flight. Highlight operational control of each flight. All right, so what does that mean, guys? If you forgot what operational control means, you're going to go to part 1. Part 1 defines operational control as the exercise of authority over, there's 3 parts: initiating, conducting, and terminating a flight. And that covers it all, right? Initiating is going to be our pre-flight planning, looking at our flight plan and our dispatch release, deciding our route, our fuel, cargo distribution, weather analysis, all that. That's initiating. Then conducting is when it's actually, the flight is being conducted en route. And then, of course, once the aircraft lands and gets into the gate, then that's going to be when our flight's terminated. So that is operational control. So the answer to my question is how many is required? The answer is enough for operational control. Now, in the real world, guys, every airline has, really, they have at least 2. They have one that they use primarily all the time. But then they have one backup facility that they generally operate about once a month just to turn everything on, have some of their dispatchers work a shift from there to make sure it's working properly. And that is in case some type of event occurs, catastrophic event, weather event, terrorist activity, something like that, where it's going to cause a major disruption in the airline. And so they will all go to that backup facility and hopefully minimize disruption for the airlines. Okay, let's go to 121.189. There are regulations, of course, on reciprocating engines, but I just want to talk to you guys about turbines. I want to talk about, you have to look at, are you going to have your performance needed for takeoff, your en route, and your landing? And we have to do all of this, guys, before we even take off. Because if there's any issues with the weight, the balance, or the runways, right, themselves that day based on weather, runway conditions, then we would have to address those before we take off. Okay, so I have here, you have to ensure, there's basically 3 categories. You got to make sure you're legal and safe for your takeoff weight, for your takeoff distance, for your takeoff run, your roll, and then your flight path once you're climbing out. Okay, so let's go to 121.189A. No person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at a weight greater than that listed in the Airplane Flight Manual, the AFM, for 2 factors. Highlight for the elevation of the airport and for the ambient temperature at takeoff. Because those 2 factors definitely affect aircraft performance, right? Our aircraft performs The worst scenario would be a high elevation airport on a hot day, right? We know density altitude affects performance. And the higher elevation we have, the less density, and that affects our engine performance, right? So basically, what that is saying is you have to make sure you don't take off overweight. There's several categories that we would look at. At least three I want you to know are going to be your structural limitation, your runway limitation, and your climb limitation. The structural limitation, guys, is provided by the aircraft manufacturer, and it's listed in the AFM. So it's a set number. For example, the Boeing 737-300, their structural takeoff limitation is 135,000 pounds. In no case can it take off greater than that. But then we also have to look at our runway limitation. Like this specific runway that we're going to take off for that day based on the elevation and the temperature. That number could be lower than 135,000 in this example, right? It might be 126,000 pounds. And then we also have to make sure that our climb performance is calculated and that it's within our weight limitations. We want to make sure, there's some regulations I'll show you in a minute that talks about your climb path and how many feet you have to be above obstacles. So basically you look at these three numbers. You will find three different values. From those three, you will pick the smallest number, because that smallest number, if you pick that and you make sure you don't go over that weight, then you fulfill all three categories. And we'll practice some in a minute. But let's say, for example, your structural limitation is 135,000. Your runway limitation was 126,000. And let's say your climb is 132,500 pounds, 132.5. Out of those, you pick the smallest number, which in this example would have been the runway. So it was 126,000. That way I know I meet every one of those. I'm good with my runway, I'm good with my climb, and I'm good with my structural limitation, So from those, I want you guys to always remember you pick the most restrictive, because the smallest number for your weight would make sure that you are good on all those categories. Okay, go to 121.189B. And it says no person operating a turbine-powered aircraft after 57 before 59 may take off that airplane at a weight greater than that listed in the AFM for the minimum distances required for takeoff. So this is talking about our distances. It says if the aircraft is certificated after September 30th, 1958, the takeoff distance may include a clearway distance. But the clearway distance included may not be greater than half of the takeoff run. So guys, clearway is different than a stopway, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But what I want you to remember is you are cleared to use your clearway for your takeoff run, your takeoff roll. So let's say you determined that you needed 200 feet of that clearway for your takeoff distance. Then you can use that. You are cleared to use your clearway, but how much of the clearway can you use? Go back to your regs, and it says you can only do that. You can only use half that, right? It cannot be greater than half your takeoff run. So you're cleared to use a clearway, but only if it's not more than half the takeoff run. What do we do on a stopway? We stop. So if there is a stopway, we cannot include that. So let's say the 200 feet you needed for that takeoff run for that day was designated as a stopway. Guys, we can't do it. We're going to have to bump some passengers or bags or change our flap settings or change runways, right? We'll have to get within our limitation because we're not permitted to use a stopway for our takeoff run because we only stop on a stopway. You're cleared to use the clearway. All right, paragraph C says no person operating a turbine engine powered airplane certificated after August 29th, 1959 may take off that airplane at a weight greater than that listed in the AFM, at which compliance with the following may be shown. And there are three things. I want you to highlight all three. We have to prove compliance prior to departure. For my pro pilots in class, you guys will be looking at this in more depth in Pro 4 and Pro 5. For my dispatchers in class, you'll do this more in your senior dispatch classes where you will actually do aircraft performance calculations. But let's look. One thing we have to make sure, guys, is that the accelerate stop distance must not exceed the length of the runway plus the length of any stopway. Guys, our accelerate stop distance corresponds with our V1 speed. I want you to write that down. Write that down. V1 was our go, no-go speed. Remember, that was our V1 is your takeoff decision speed. After you pass V1, even if you lose your critical engine, you have to continue the takeoff. And if you did lose an engine, you would just wrap back around and land, right? But once you go past V1, guys, you are no longer within your accelerate stop distance, which means you will not have enough runway left to abort the takeoff. So it's saying here we have to calculate our accelerate stop distance, and it cannot exceed the length of the runway. That makes sense. Plus the length of the stopway, because guys, we can use the stopway for our accelerate stop distance. Remember, that's what it's designated for. So for our accelerate stop distance, we would calculate that. And if it needed an extra 300 feet of a stopway, that's okay, as long as you have it. Number 2 says, the takeoff distance must not exceed the length of the runway plus the length of any clearway, except the length of any clearway included must not be greater than 1/2 the length of the runway. Very similar to the reg we read in part Charlie, or part Bravo, excuse me. So again, you got to make sure that your takeoff distance doesn't exceed the length of the runway plus your clearway, as long as that's not greater than 1/2 the length of your runway. Excuse me. And then number 3 is just straight common sense. And it says the takeoff run must not be greater than the length of the runway. Yeah, we figured that. So to me, that was just straight common sense, but it's in the regs. Okay, so we talked about making sure we don't take off overweight, and that we'll look at least, there's several variables, but at least the structural limitation, the runway limitation, and the climb. Out of those 3, we pick the smallest number so that it meets all 3 categories. Then we have to make sure we calculate our takeoff distance and that we can meet all the regulations for that. We don't exceed our accelerate stop distances within that takeoff distance, or the runway, plus stopway, or it can include the clearway as long as it's not more than 1/2 the runway. And obviously make sure your runway is in fact long enough for your takeoff distance. Okay, paragraph delta, look at D. I know this is dry information, just hang in there. It's important. I mean, this is very important for safety of flight, so I need you guys to understand it. Because you'll have to calculate this or, look at this before every single flight, every leg. So if, let's say you've got 3 legs for that day, 3 legs, you'd have to calculate performance for all 3 flights before departure. D says no person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at a weight greater than that listed in the AFM, and then it lists 1 and 2. 1 says that it allows a takeoff path that clears all obstacles by at least 35 feet vertically. It's got some things in parentheses there, or by at least 200 feet horizontally within the airport boundaries, and by at least 300 feet horizontally after passing the boundaries. And then paragraph 2 it's very similar, but it was if aircraft certificated after September 30th, 1958. Same thing pretty much, though, minus that 0.01 D. It says height at least 35 feet vertically or by at least 200 feet horizontally within the airport boundaries and 300 feet horizontally after passing the boundaries. So basically, guys, we want to make sure when we take off that we're not skimming the trees, right? We're at least 35 feet above anything that's within that path of our takeoff. Okay, paragraph E. And I have a question here. What factors play a role? So paragraph E. It says in determining maximum weights, minimum distances, and flight paths. And those are the 3 things we talked about, right? Because in looking at all these, under paragraph A through D, correction must be made. I want you guys to highlight that. Correction must be made for the, and then they list a whole bunch of factors here that affect these categories that determine how heavy or how much we can weigh at takeoff and how long our takeoff run's going to be, and make sure that our flight path clears the 35 feet and 200 feet horizontally. So one, it says the runway. Highlight that. That's one factor. Just the runway itself, right? How long is the runway? The second thing, guys, in no particular order, just reading through the rec, second thing I want you to highlight is elevation. It says the elevation of the airport. And like we talked about earlier, we know that higher elevation airports would have a higher altitude, right? Is going to have less dense air, which does affect aircraft performance. So we got to take into account elevation. The next thing says the effective runway gradient. Where we find that, guys, is on our Jeppesen charts or instrument approach procedures. Have the runway slope. It might be +2% or -2%, and that tells you whether the runway has an upward or downward slope, a gradient. Because it's not always exactly even, right? It might be a little bit up or down, just by a few 1 to 2, 3% up or down. The next one says the ambient temperature. So that's another factor. How would temperature affect performance? What do you think? Which would be worse on aircraft performance? Warmer temperatures or cooler temperatures? What do you guys think? Think about it for a second. What would be worse on aircraft performance? We need air for our engines, air intake into our engines. We need air for our propellers as well if we have a prop. And we need air to achieve lift over our wings. So warmer temperatures, not going to be as good, right? We're going to have a reduction in aircraft performance. The next component says wind component. How would wind affect aircraft performance? Which one's better, headwind or tailwind? What do you think? Headwind. Headwind for both takeoff and landing is preferred, is considered ideal, right? Again, because we need air, right? So a headwind is going to provide, it's going to be the air coming straight on, so that air is going to go over the upper camber of the wing, creating that pressure differential from the top and bottom of the wing, which will create lift, which means that we need less distance for our takeoff run, right? Which is good for our takeoff performance. So our wind component definitely affects performance. Ideally, we have a headwind. Guys, if we have to take off with a tailwind, every aircraft has tailwind limitations published by their aircraft manufacturer. It is generally 10 knots. But that doesn't mean that you would be comfortable with that. You might decide, you know what, on today, the runway is slippery, my aircraft is really heavy, and I really don't feel comfortable more than a 5-knot tailwind. And that's totally up to you, and that would be your call. You will decide what is your comfort level as you progress throughout your career. And obviously, when you're more junior, you're going to need to be much more conservative, right? Maybe have a little, not allow such a great number of takeoff, a great tailwind limitation until you have more experience. Or you might just say, this is my number always. Like, this is my safety net, right? But you do have to take into account wind. And then it says, and if operating limitations exist for the minimum distances required for takeoff for wet runways. I want you to highlight the word wet. So there are different numbers for wet runways, for the wet runway versus dry runway. Which one is better? Obviously, we want a dry runway. Wet runway is going to take us, is going to require a longer distance for our takeoff distance. And also, it would take us longer to stop if we needed to reject the takeoff, right? Then it says the runway surface condition, highlight dry or wet. Next sentence says wet runway distances associated with grooved or porous friction course runways, if provided in the AFM, may be used only for runways that are grooved or treated with a PFC overlay, and that the operator determines are designed, constructed, and maintained in a manner acceptable to the administrator. Translation, some runways are grooved. You will know by looking at your instrument approach chart. On generally, it's a 10.9a page, and it has runway information. It will let you know if a runway's grooved. And grooves are kind of like when you're, you know how you're on the interstate and on the far right lane, if you go over a little too much, you hit those bumps, it's like, kind of like that. Well, runways have grooves in it. They're really tiny. They're not like massive, but they are small, and they are there to capture moisture, so that if, for example, you have like a short duration of light precipitation, it will actually hold that rain, that moisture, and not run off onto the runway. So there are times that we could actually consider the runway dry because the runway is grooved. But obviously, if it's been raining heavy rain for a substantial amount of time, we're not going to take the risk and call the runway dry, right, when it's actually wet. So I don't know if that made sense, but you do take into account if the runway's grooved as well. So in some cases, like I said, light precipitation, short amount of time, you might consider the runway dry. And that might actually, you know, allow you to take off heavier, not have to kick passengers, things like that. But if it's cutting it really close, guys, if it's really close and you're like, well, if the runway is in fact wet, we're going to run off the runway, then obviously we're going to err on the side of caution and we're going to call it wet. So how do you feel about the factors that play a role? Let's do an example. Okay. First thing I want you guys to know is we're gonna practice. And I wish I had written down an example. I'm actually gonna write this in. Let's see. Okay. I'll fix that. 1 second. Okay, so what I want us to look at here, guys, is this is a performance chart. Everything is now online in the real world, embedded in a computerized system, but I want you to see this. The question that I would ask you on your test is, I would say, what is the maximum takeoff weight? And it'll be for a specific flight. I'll give you the structural limitation, which for this is 135,000. I will tell you the runway, and I will tell you the temperature. So this is what it would look like so far. This says it's for Nashville International. This is their engine, CFM 56-3, B1 for high bypass engines. And this is engine bleeds for your AC, PAX, and auto position. Don't worry too much about that, but you can do a bleeds on or a bleeds off takeoff depending on performance conditions. But what I want you guys to see here is this is for takeoff. I know it's for takeoff because there's always a lower flap setting for departure. So, you know, our flaps are located on the trailing edge of the wings and they extend downward, and they provide additional area surface for our camber, right? So it provides additional lift when it's a lower flap setting. So it would just be like if this is my wing, this is the back of my wing, this is like 1 degree, 5 degree flaps, and sometimes maybe 15 degrees flaps, but that's usually landing. So we'll say for this one, our Boeing 733 has flaps 1 or 5 settings for departure. If it was landing, it would be flaps 15, 30, or 45, and it depends on your aircraft, but you use flaps for both takeoff and landing. The lower flap setting for takeoff is just going to be just enough to increase that camber, to increase that airflow for that pressure differential, right? We know that as the air flows over the top of the wing, according to Bernoulli, as velocity increases of the air, the pressure decreases. So we have a low pressure created on the top of the wing, and we have a relatively higher pressure at the bottom, and we know the high wants to reach the low. So it's going to push upward. Also, Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So as that air goes over the wing and pushes down, the opposite reaction is we have that upward force of lift. So I'm explaining that because I want you to understand a lower flap setting is for departure, because it's going to actually increase lift. Where if you put it down to 30 degrees or 45 degrees, now that's going to increase drag, which we're going to want that for landing, because that's going to slow us down and reduce our landing distance. So flaps 1 is for takeoff. I'm going to already tell you our maximum takeoff weight for the structural category, which is provided in the AFM, Airplane Flight Manual, for this airplane is 135,000 pounds. Then you have to go here and you have to look at your runway numbers. And we have to pick our runway. So let's pick runway 02 right. And I want it to be 0 degrees Celsius. So I'll provide that information on your test or quiz, right? So you look right here on 02 right, and you go down to where the temperatures are at. Now look, these F's, I know it looks like Fahrenheit, but this is just bad design. If you look up here, actually all the temperatures are in Celsius. The F is telling us that at these temperatures, these upward temperatures, the limiting factor will be our field, which is our runway. So just ignore the F's. So 0 is actually 0 degrees Celsius. Then you go over here and you stop at your runway, which is runway 02 right. That's the length of the runway. And the limitation here is 131.6. That decimal is like a comma and you add 2 zeros. So your runway limitation is 131,600. So you would add that in. So here's our runway limit, right? 131,600 pounds, right? We'll leave that off. And then we need our climb limit. Our climb limit, guys and kids, and a lot of students forget this, so don't forget your climb limit, because I'm not going to put runway and climb on there. It's just going to look just like the top part. What's the maximum takeoff weight? I'll give you the structural number, the runway, and the temperature. You have to know to look at runway and climb. So you just look for the word climb, which is right here, and you can see there's just one column, so you just find your temperature on the left, and you go all the way over, and it's 127.7. What did I say that decimal means? Good, really a comma, 127, and you add 2 zeros. Okay, we have three numbers. We have the structural number, the runway, and the climb. Which one's the smallest? Climb limit. So the most we can take off, guys, for this one is 127,700 pounds. If we do that, we know we're good on our climb. We know we're good on our runway because it's below our runway limit, and we know we're good structurally. You have to pick the smallest number. Now, there's some corrections I want you to see, and they're at the bottom of the chart. So you go down here, and there's 3 corrections, and I want to talk about those, and I want you to make notes on it and understand it because you'll see it again. So looking at your runway, guys, on 02 right, this says it is in a 0 wind condition. Well, it is unlikely we won't have any wind component for departure. So let's say we had a 2-knot headwind. I'll give it to you in the given information. HW is for headwind, TW is for tailwind. CW would be a crosswind. So right down here, it says you add LB is pounds, KT is knots, HW is headwind. The next line, SUB, is subtract pounds per knot for tailwind. So I want us to think about it for a minute. Headwinds, are they a good or bad thing? They're good. Headwind is good. So a headwind would allow us to take off with more weight, which is why there is an addition. Tailwinds are not good. So if we have a tailwind on takeoff, we're going to have to correct for that by subtracting a number. You do not add zeros. It's just this straight number. And it is in pounds. So this one, sorry, lost my mouse. Runway 02 right. Go down here and you just line up with the column. And it's a 15 knot correction. And that's add pounds per knot. 15 pounds per knot. I have 2 knot headwind, so I will take 15 times 2, which is 30 pounds. And I would add that to my runway limit. Do you guys see what I'm saying? So I know that's not a lot, but hey, every bit counts. And a lot of times these numbers are a lot bigger. Like, see, look at this one. These numbers right here, this one was for runway 02 center, you could add 145 pounds per knot. That would add up quick. Like, you had a 10 knot headwind, that's 14,500 pounds, right? I mean, not 14,000, excuse me, 1,450 pounds. And then, okay, so how do you feel about headwind? You're good with that? And honestly, guys, that one didn't even matter because we knew our climb limit was a limitation anyway, but I still want to show you the correction. Now, let's say we had a 2 knot tailwind. Well, that's going to make a big difference here, guys. You go to 02 right and you look down here and it says minus 670. That is 670 pounds per knot of tailwind. Let's say you had a 5 knot tailwind. You would take 670 times 5. That value then gets subtracted from your runway limit, because remember, this is a runway correction. When you go to the climb column, guys, there is nothing there, so there is no correction for your climb calculation. It's only for your runway. I'm going to ask you a question on the test, and it's going to be about your headwind versus tailwind on your takeoff performance. So I want you to know, if you have a headwind on your departure, this will allow for an increase in your takeoff runway limit. Where if you have a tailwind limitation, this will result in a decrease in your takeoff weight limitation for your runway. Headwind you add, tailwind you subtract. Now, the other correction, guys, I want you to write down is ASI V1 ADJ. ASI stands for anti-skid inoperative. V1 is your takeoff decision speed. You can go back to part 1 if you need to look that up. And then ADJ is adjustment. So I want us to talk about this. Anti-skid is just like it sounds. It's a system in our aircraft that helps us to stop. It helps us not to skid. Now, if your anti-skid is inoperative, do you think it's going to take us longer to stop if we had to, or less distance to stop? If anti-skid's inoperative, it will take us longer to stop, right? Which means our V1 speed is going to occur earlier in the takeoff run. It will be a lower number because we need more distance to stop, right? So that we don't run off the runway and we don't hydroplane. It's kind of like our anti-locks in our braking system in our vehicles. So I want you guys to see here that it's a subtraction, and you don't add zeros, and it's not in pounds. Your V1 speed is in what unit? It's in knots. So let's say our V1 speed for takeoff was 125 knots. Let's say that was our takeoff, our V1 speed. Yeah, it says 125 knots. Runway 02 right, our anti-skid's inoperative, then we're going to take 125 and we're going to subtract 22 knots from it. It's very important we have an accurate V1 correction, guys, because we know that's the point where we make our decision. If something happens before V1, and we lose our critical engine, or something is not right in the aircraft and you feel like you need to reject the takeoff, before V1, you can stop, you can do full brakes, full thrust reversers, and you are within your accelerate stop distance that you calculated. But once you pass V1, there's a call out in the aircraft, and the first officer does the call out as well. And you've now committed to the takeoff, right? You have to take off, even if it's to climb right back around and land, but you have to take off. Okay. I know that's a lot on that one, so make sure you go back and practice that again. Review that one. I just want you guys to see, this is from Airline Ground Schools. This is a weight and balance page. And whenever you look at your performance for your takeoff alternate, your destination, and destination alternates, that these are the 3 numbers. Remember I said there's a structural number provided by the airplane flight manual. Then we look at that chart like what I showed you in the last slide for runway and climb. And from those 3 numbers, we pick the smallest number. We pick the most restrictive number. The whole point of that is then when you go up here and you start calculating your weight and balance, when we get down to this box, which is how much our airplane weighs at takeoff, we will make sure we do not exceed our limitation. If that's greater than our limitation, something's got to go. We got to kick people off, our bags off, try another runway, try another flap setting, try to get different performance numbers. But either way, we cannot take off overweight. Absolutely against the regulations, and it's unsafe. Okay. I do want you, even though it's not on here, for your own reading, I want you to read 121.191 and look at your en route limitations. And look at paragraph A, 1 and 2. And this is basically 121.191 is we calculate what would happen. There's two scenarios, and honestly, it's not very clear in the regs, but we calculate what would happen if on our takeoff climb we lost an engine. And then we also say what would happen basically if we're flying over mountainous terrain and we lose an engine. For the takeoff, we want to make sure we can continue to climb and go, especially if we're climbing over some type of terrain, right? We want to make sure that we can climb over that with one engine and up and still clear it. And then the same thing, if we're flying and we're in between mountainous peaks, and we've lost an engine, we want to be able to land between those mountainous peaks at an airport. And that is called a drift down alternate. Drift down alternate. And there's method 1 and method 2. So I'm not going to teach you that now. It's fairly complicated, but in the real world, it is a calculation that's done with a performance-based computer program, and you just have to basically punch in the runway, your weight, and the temperature, and it will let you know if you need a drift down alternate or not. So now let's go to landing. 121.195, turbine engine powered landing limitations for destination airports. So guys, we already talked about takeoff. We got to make sure we don't take off overweight. We have to make sure our takeoff distances are calculated and that our flight paths are calculated. Same thing for landing. We want to make sure we don't land overweight, right? We want to make sure our landing distance is calculated. And we want to look at all the variables that affect our performance as well. So go to paragraph A. It says, no person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane at such a weight that allowing for normal consumption of fuel and oil in flight to the destination or alternate airport, the weight of the airplane on arrival would exceed the landing weight set forth in the airplane flight manual, and it's the same two variables, elevation and ambient temperature. You cannot take off at a weight that would make you land overweight, right? So we would have to calculate this before departure, because if it looks like we're landing overweight, we got to kick some weight off before we even take off. Same thing, guys, we're going to at least look at the structural runway and climb limitation. Structural is already provided. It's in the airplane flight manual. The runway and climb limit, remember you look at those from those flap charts. Landing is going to have a higher flap setting. It's going to be flaps 15, 30, 45 degrees, whatever your aircraft has. And you would look at all three of those numbers, and from those three numbers, you pick the smallest number. Okay, go to paragraph B. And I want you guys to look towards the bottom, and I want you to highlight 60%, the 60%. Because the very bottom there, and the very beginning actually says, no person operating a turbine engine powered airplane may take off that airplane unless its weight on arrival, skip down after the parentheses, would allow a full stop landing at the intended destination within 60% of the effective length of each runway described below from a point 50 feet above the runway obstruction clearance plane in the runway. Okay, so basically that means you have to land within 60% of the effective runway length. I do want you guys to know and write down this is for a dry runway. Write that down. That is if your runway is dry. You have to be able to land within 60% of the effective runway length. This example here, guys, the runway is 8,000 feet. 60% of that is going to be 4,800. All of this is done prior to departure to make sure once we land, we can land within 60% of the effective runway and 50 feet above, at a point 50 feet above the intersection of the obstruction clearance. Okay, that last part in paragraph B says, for the purpose of determining the allowable landing weight, the following is assumed. Number one, the airplane is landed on the most favorable runway and in the most favorable direction in still air. So obviously, if available, that would be a headwind. We also want to land with a headwind. As a tailwind, guys, is just going to push us along further, right? Requiring longer runway distance to land. And then two, it said basically the same thing. Airplanes land on the most suitable runway considering the probable wind velocity and direction. Paragraph C, I'm not going to go over, but that's for turboprops. And that one was just had to be 70% of the runway. But I won't test you on that. But if you need that, that was for turboprops, alternate airport, 70%. Go to paragraph D. D is if your runway is wet. So it says, unless based on a showing of actual operating landing techniques on wet runways, highlight the word wet, a shorter landing distance, but never less than that required by paragraph B of this section, which was the 60%, has been approved for a specific type and model airplane and included in the AFM. No person may take off a turbojet-powered airplane when the appropriate weather reports and forecasts or a combination, so METARs, TAFs, any combination, indicate the runways at the destination may be wet or slippery at the estimated time of arrival, unless the effective runway length at the destination is at least 115% of the runway required under paragraph B. Okay, this is really important. I want you guys to hear this. This is like the worst wording of a regulation, but here's what I want you to know. I want you to know how to read these regulations. You have to read them slowly. Like if you read through them fast, you got to read them several times, and you have to know how to read these regulations word for word and understand them. It's very important, guys, to your safety in the future and to make sure you don't violate any regulations. So this one was really weird wording. It said 115% of the runway distance required in paragraph B. What did B require? What percentage? So you're not landing within 115% of the runway. You are landing within 115% of the value you calculated for your 60% runway. So you basically calculate the 60% and you just add an extra 15% on that, an additional 15% for your runway if it's wet. They want you to have more runway to land at. And again, that main lesson, to be honest, is I just want you to learn how to read your regs, to slowly read them, and to never trust anyone's interpretation. You sit down, you read your regs. Make sure you understand it. Don't even take my word for it, right? Make sure you read it. Okay, skipping along to 121.363, because this is a huge, 121 is massive. So I basically try to pick the ones I think you need to pass your ATP or ADX exam, as well as an interview. Okay, did you find it? It's under subpart L, 121.363. It says each certificate holder, which is each airline, is primarily responsible for 1 and 2. 1 is the airworthiness of its aircraft, including airframes, aircraft engines, propellers, appliances, and parts. And 2, the performance and maintenance. Here's what I want you guys to see here. Who's responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft? The certificate holder. Under Part 91, who was responsible for ensuring the airplane was airworthy was our PIC, right? Or our operator. And who was in charge of maintaining airworthiness was our owner-operator. But I want you guys to see under Part 121 that the certificate holder is responsible for the airworthiness of the aircraft. Now, who determines it? It's still going to be our PIC, right, before departure. But what I want you guys to see is there's some differences in the wording for 91 and 121. So which one do you follow? You follow the one specific to your type of operation. So if you're flying a 121 carrier, 121 supersedes any rules if they are different than Part 91, because Part 91 is general aviation. Okay, this is an easy one. Composition of flight crew, 121.385. How many flight crew members? Remember, flight crew are just think about it as the people who can touch the flight controls. So we're talking about first officer and our captain. And that is what is required under 121.385 paragraph Charlie. Says the minimum pilot crew is 2 pilots, and the certificate holder shall. What's the word shall mean? Shall means we must. Remember, shall is imperative. It says the certificate holder shall designate 1 pilot as pilot in command and the other as second in command. Pilot in command, the real world, we call them captains. They sit on the left side. And the right side is our second in commands, aka FOs, which are first officers. We have to have 2. And guys, we have to have 2 in there at all times. 2. So if a pilot has to go to the lavatory, a flight attendant must go in and sit in their seat. While they cannot fly the aircraft, it is still required. All right, talking about flight attendants. Guys, a number of flight attendants is based on seating capacity, not passengers. I want you guys to know that. Okay, 121.391A says, except as specified in .393 and .394, each certificate holder must provide at least the following flight attendants on board each passenger carrying airplane when passengers are on board. So if you're flying an empty aircraft with just the flight crew, and there's no passengers, we do not need flight attendants. And obviously UPS and FedEx that fly cargo and packages, they do not need flight attendants. So look at 1, 2, 3, and 4. Highlight all of them. Airplanes having a max payload of more than 7,500 pounds and having a seating capacity of more than 9 but less than 51 passengers. I know that's weird wording. More than 9 means 10. Less than 51 means 50. So from 10 to 50 passenger seats, we need 1 flight attendant. I didn't say passengers. There might be 1 passenger on there, right? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many passengers are on there. It matters about the seating capacity. The next one says more than 19 but less than 51. So that's 20 to 50, and it's still 1 flight attendant. I have no idea why they wrote that. So 10 to 50 is 1 flight attendant. Number 3 says more than 50, which is how much? 51. Less than 101 passengers, which is how much? 100. So from 51 to 100, it says you need 2. So here's the gist, guys. For every 50 seats, every up to and including 50 seats, you need 1 flight attendant. So you got 50 seats, you got a flight attendant. You have another 50 seats, you have another flight attendant. Now, let's say you had 120 seats. 120. All right, we got 50, that's 1. Another 50, that's 1. So we're at 100 seats. We still have 20 seats left. Even though it's not a whole 50, it's above that. So we need another flight attendant, right? Right then and there, we need 3 flight attendants based on number of seats. Subpart N, I just want you guys to know some training terms that you might see. Group 1 and 2, initial training, transition training, differences training, and even though it's not on there, there's a few more like upgrade training. You might see some of those terms I want you to be familiar with. Group 1, that type of training is going to be for props, including reciprocating powered and turboprop powered airplanes. And Group 2 is going to be turbojet. And then training that you get initially when you're hired at a 121 carrier is initial training. I want you guys to see it said training required for crew members and dispatchers who have not, highlight the word not, qualified and served in the same capacity on another airplane of the same group. Crew members are pilots and who else? Flight attendants. That's right. I'm going to assume that you said that because we went over that a lot in class. So that includes pilots, flight attendants, and dispatchers. Transition training, guys, it said required for crew members and dispatchers who have qualified and served in the same capacity on another airplane. So you've already done your initial training, guys. You're just transitioning in the same group. So there might be some transition training. Upgrade training, when you upgrade to an aircraft, right? So that's crew members, flight engineers. Differences training, it's anytime the administrator feels differences training is appropriate. So let's say they purchased a new system in the aircraft, something new in the flight management system, the FMS, something new on the avionics panel, some new upgrade, and they want everyone to know how to operate it. Then the FAA might mandate there's differences training needed, and everyone has to go through that. Sometimes it can be done online. Sometimes it's in a sim. Sometimes it's in a classroom. It depends on what the airline determines is their preferred method, and then whatever gets FAA approved. And then I want you guys to know what CRM and DRM is. So go to 121.404, and it says here that after March 1998, no certificate holder may use a person as a flight crew member. So those are just our pilots. And after March 19, 1999, no certificate holder may use a person as a flight attendant or aircraft dispatcher unless they have completed an approved crew resource management or dispatch resource management training class. So guys, I want you guys to know that there's initial CRM or DRM training. Guys, crew resource management is a very important class that you'll take, and you'll have training every year. Crew resource management. It tells you how to manage your crew and all your available resources so that you can operate as safely as possible by reducing the risk of human errors and increasing safety, right? So basically, CRM is all about how humans interact with machines. Like dispatchers, pilots, controllers, mechanics, everyone has to work some part of the industry, right? And just being a human, we have flaws. We can be fatigued. We can communicate poorly. We can have poor situational awareness. So we can never eliminate human error, but we can reduce it. The only way we can eliminate human error is to completely eliminate the human component, which is impossible even with artificial intelligence, because who do you think designed artificial intelligence? Who do you think controls unmanned aircraft, right? There's still always a human component to it. So CRM basically talks about, hey, how can we reduce human error and increase safety and reduce accidents? And then later they developed dispatch resource management, which is very similar concepts, except it really focuses on the pilot and dispatch relationship and their teamwork. So if you look at basically any study that's been published, they will say that anywhere from 80 to 90% of every aircraft accident has occurred because of human error. And it's oftentimes pilot error, guys, because pilots are the ones flying the airplane. So this is a huge area that we need to constantly work on improving. Some areas that are part of CRM or DRM include communication, teamwork, situational awareness, risk mitigation, using your available resources, prioritizing properly or effectively, being an effective listener, basically anything and everything that plays a role in being a good team player. And here's the thing, guys, no, our human nature is to work on our own usually. Like, how many people really love group projects? Probably not that many people. It's the same thing in the industry, right? But we have to work together as a team. This really is the ultimate team sport. So you'll have a CRM class in college, then you'll have CRM training throughout your entire aviation career, wherever you're at. And it's just really important, guys. And I want you to always take it very serious. Because like I said, this is a lot, most every accident comes from us making poor decisions. Even if it's weather related, oftentimes we have made the poor choice to fly into that weather. We didn't obtain an appropriate briefing. We didn't look at the weather. We gave into pressure. We are fatigued. That's a big one. Awareness of your fatigue. Being aware of how much stress you have, and if you feel like you're physically and mentally fit to fly. You actually have to sign on your release for 121 that you are physically fit to fly the aircraft, mentally, physically safe to fly the airplane. Which means if you're going through something rough in life, you're going through medical, your family, your parent is ill, a divorce, a sick child. Guys, sometimes stuff like that, those stresses really affect us, and we don't need to get behind an airplane, a desk for a dispatcher, maintenance, and we need to just call out, or we need to say, hey, you need to put me on something else today, put me on give me some online training to do today. You have to be aware of your limitations, and that's what CRM talks about. Just bringing awareness to that and knowing how to mitigate those risks. Well, that's a wrap. I hope that you have learned a little bit about 121. I know some of this is really dry, but I really want you guys to go back, review it, read these regulations on your own, and let me know if you have any questions. And I will talk to you soon. Have a lovely day. Do something great with your life.